The deepest wounds are carved by the hands we once held in love. For Alpha King Thorne, it came when he saw the woman he'd never stopped loving dragged to the auction block in chains. The crowd jeers at the pregnant Omega slave, but Thorne sees Liora, the healer who saved his life and vanished. He buys her without thinking. In his tent, the truth hits him. She carries his child, conceived before betrayal separated them. The woman he thought was dead is broken and afraid. What cruel twist of fate brought his greatest love to the auction block as a broken slave? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the castle's stone walls as Alpha King Thorne stood at his chamber window, watching the kingdom he had built with blood and determination. At 42, his broad shoulders still carried the weight of leadership with ease, though silver now touched his dark hair at the temples. The scar along his jawline, a memento from the Battle of Redwater, caught the light as he turned from the window. 3 years of rule had brought prosperity to Valenhall, but the crown felt heavier each day. The victories that once filled him with purpose now seemed hollow echoes of a younger man's ambitions. He had everything a king could want: wealth, power, respect. Yet something essential remained missing from his life. "Your Majesty," came the familiar voice of Sir Marcus, his most trusted knight and advisor. The greying warrior entered with careful steps, his weathered face bearing news that would change everything. "The slave auction is beginning in the market square. You requested to be informed." Thorne nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure why he had asked to know. Perhaps it was the restlessness that had plagued him lately. Or maybe it was the strange dreams that had been visiting his sleep, dreams of gentle hands tending his wounds, of whispered promises under starlight. The memory came unbidden, as it often did during quiet moments. 5 years ago, before he claimed the throne, he had been gravely wounded in a skirmish with bandits near the Thornwood forest. Bleeding and alone, he had stumbled into a healer's cottage where a young Omega woman, with kind eyes and steady hands, had saved his life. Liora. Even now, her name sent a familiar ache through his chest. She had been beautiful in a quiet way. Not the bold beauty that commanded attention in royal courts, but something deeper. Her auburn hair had caught firelight like autumn leaves, and her green eyes held wisdom beyond her years. For 3 weeks, she had tended his wounds while he recovered in secret, hidden from those who would see him dead before he could claim his birthright. Those had been the most peaceful days of his life. No politics, no warfare, no burden of leadership, just a wounded man grateful for the care of a woman who asked nothing in return. They had talked through long evenings about everything and nothing, her herbs and healing knowledge, his dreams, of a kingdom where strength served justice rather than oppression, their shared love of ancient stories and forgotten songs. The attraction between them had grown slowly, like dawn breaking over distant mountains. She was Omega and he was Alpha, but in that small cottage such distinctions had seemed meaningless. What mattered was the way she laughed at his stories, the gentle touch of her fingers as she changed his bandages, the comfortable silence they shared while she prepared her medicines. On his final night in her care, they had walked together under the stars. The words had come without planning, honest and simple. He loved her. Her response had been a kiss that tasted of hope and healing herbs, followed by a night of tenderness that had marked him more permanently than any battle scar. He had promised to return for her once he secured his throne. She had promised to wait, her hand in his, as they watched the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. But when he came back 6 months later, flush with victory and ready to claim his bride, he found only ashes where her cottage had stood. The local villagers spoke in hushed tones of raiders who had come in the night. They said the healer had perished in the flames, along with an elderly woman who might have been her grandmother. Thorne had searched the ruins himself, desperate for any sign that she might have escaped, but found only charred remains and the broken pieces of clay vessels that had once held her precious medicines. Grief had nearly broken him then. For weeks, he had raged against fate, against enemies who struck at innocence, against his own foolishness for leaving her unprotected. Only the pressing demands of his new kingdom had eventually pulled him from despair and forced him to bury his heart beneath the duties of crown and throne. Now, 3 years later, he ruled justly and well. The people prospered under his leadership. Trade flourished, and his armies had grown strong enough to deter most would-be invaders. Yet he remained alone in his success, turning away every potential bride his counselors suggested. No woman had ever measured against the memory of those perfect weeks with Liora. "Shall I prepare your horse, your majesty?" Marcus asked, studying his king's distant expression with concern. "The auction will end before midday." Thorne found himself nodding, though he couldn't explain the compulsion that drew him toward the market square. Something in his chest pulled tight with an inexplicable urgency, as if destiny itself was calling. The ride through his capital city filled him with the usual mixture of pride and responsibility. Citizens bowed respectfully as he passed. Children waved from doorways. Merchants hawked their wares with enthusiasm, born of prosperity. Valenhall had become everything he had envisioned during those long conversations with Liora, a place where strength served the common good rather than the whims of tyrants. Yet, as he approached the market square, a different energy filled the air. The crowd that had gathered for the slave auction was rougher than his usual subjects, drawn from the kingdom's edges and populated by those who saw human misery as opportunity. Thorne's jaw tightened at the sight, though he knew such auctions were necessary evils in a world where war and crime created refugees who had no other recourse. He positioned himself where he could observe without being recognized, pulling his hood low and keeping Marcus close. The auctioneer, a thin man with calculating eyes, was already deep into his presentations. Slaves of various ages and conditions were led to the block in chains, their stories reduced to crude assessments of their potential value. Thorne watched with growing disgust until something made his blood run cold. A figure was being dragged toward the auction block, a woman heavily pregnant, her wrists bound with rope that had left angry red marks on her skin. Her dark auburn hair hung in matted tangles around a face that was thinner than he remembered, but unmistakably familiar. The world seemed to stop. Liora stood on the auction block, very much alive and very much in chains. The auctioneer's voice cut through Thorne's shock like a blade through flesh. "Here we have a breeding omega, well along with child. She's been trained in household duties and has some knowledge of herbs and healing. Starting bid is 50 silver pieces." Thorne's hands clenched into fists as he watched Liora sway on her feet, one hand instinctively protecting her rounded belly. Her green eyes, once bright with laughter and gentle wisdom, now held the hollow look of someone who had endured too much pain for too long. Dark circles shadowed her face, and her torn dress revealed the evidence of rough treatment. Bruises on her arms, scratches along her neck, but it was unmistakably her. The woman he had mourned, the woman he had loved, the woman whose memory had haunted every empty night since he thought she died. 60 silver, called a merchant from the crowd, leering at Liora with undisguised hunger. 70, shouted another, and Thorne recognized him as a brothel keeper from the city's seedier districts. The bidding continued, each number driving deeper into Thorne's soul like nails into a coffin. How was she here? How was she alive? The questions thundered through his mind, but they were overwhelmed by a more immediate and primal need to get her away from these predators, to protect her, to understand what cruel twist of fate had brought them to this moment. 100 gold pieces, Thorne said, his voice cutting through the crowd noise like a sword through silk. The auction fell silent. 100 gold pieces was more than most of these people saw in a year. enough to buy a small farm or a craftsman's entire workshop. The auctioneer's eyes widened with greedy delight, while the crowd murmured in surprised appreciation. "Did I hear correctly?" the auctioneer asked, his voice trembling with excitement. 100 gold pieces? "You heard correctly," Thorne replied, stepping forward and letting his hood fall back. The crowd immediately recognized him, dropping to their knees in hasty bows, but he kept his eyes fixed on Liora. The moment their gazes met, he saw recognition dawn in her face, followed immediately by something that cut him deeper than any weapon ever had: fear. She was afraid of him. This woman, who had once welcomed him into her arms, who had kissed him under the stars and promised to wait for his return, now looked at him as if he were another threat to be endured. "Your Majesty," the auctioneer stammered, bowing so low his forehead nearly touched his knees. Of course. The Omega is yours." Thorne approached the auction block with careful steps, aware that any sudden movement might send Liora into panic. Up close, he could see more clearly what she had suffered. Her wrists were raw from rough rope, and fading bruises painted her arms in shades of yellow and purple. Someone had hurt her repeatedly, and the knowledge filled him with a rage that threatened to consume his careful control. "Easy," he said softly, the same tone he might use with a wounded animal. "I'm going to help you down." She flinched when he reached for her, but allowed him to steady her descent from the block. Her legs shook with exhaustion and pregnancy, and he caught her when she stumbled, feeling how thin she had become beneath the worn fabric of her dress. "Marcus," he called to his knight, never taking his eyes off Liora, "my horse, and send word ahead. I want the royal physician waiting in my chambers immediately." "Your chambers, Your Majesty?" Marcus asked, clearly surprised. "My chambers," Thorne confirmed with a tone that brooked no argument. He lifted Liora in his arms, noting how light she felt despite her pregnancy. She was trembling now, whether from cold, fear, or exhaustion. He couldn't tell. The ride back to the castle passed in tense silence. Liora sat sideways across his saddle, his arm around her waist to keep her secure, but she held herself as rigidly as possible to avoid contact. Every few minutes he felt her steal glances at his face, as if she couldn't quite believe what was happening. Once inside the castle, Thorne carried her directly to his private chambers, ignoring the shocked stares of servants and courtiers who witnessed their king carrying a pregnant slave through the halls. He set her gently on the chair beside his fireplace and began building up the flames to warm the room. "The physician will be here soon," he said, keeping his voice calm and non-threatening. "You're safe now. I promise you're safe." Liora's laugh was bitter and broken. "Safe," she repeated, the words seeming to taste like poison in her mouth. "I haven't been safe since the night they came for me." "What happened?" The words came out rougher than he intended. "I came back for you, Liora. I came back as soon as I could, but your cottage was burned. They told me you were dead." Her green eyes filled with tears that she wiped away with angry swipes of her hand. "I was supposed to be dead. That was the plan." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "They came in the night while I was gathering moonflower by the stream. When I returned, the cottage was burning with my grandmother inside. I tried to run to her, but they were waiting." Thorne's heart clenched as he knelt beside her chair. Who did this?" "Men wearing your colors," she said, and the words hit him like a physical blow. "They said they had orders to eliminate any complications that might interfere with your rule. They said a king couldn't be tied to some common Omega healer." The betrayal cut deeper than he had thought possible. Someone in his inner circle had done this, had killed an innocent old woman and condemned the woman he loved to years of slavery and abuse, all in his name. "Liora, I swear to you on my father's grave, I never gave such orders. I would never—" "It doesn't matter now," she interrupted, her hand moving protectively over her belly. "What's done is done." A knock at the door announced the arrival of the royal physician, an elderly man named Master Aldrich, who had served the crown for decades. Thorne rose to admit him, grateful for the interruption that might ease the terrible tension in the room. "Your Majesty requested my immediate attendance?" Aldrich asked, then stopped short when he saw Liora. His professional eye immediately took in her condition, the pregnancy, the obvious signs of maltreatment, the exhaustion that surrounded her like a cloak. "This woman needs care," Thorne said. "Simply, see to her health and that of her child. Spare no expense." As Aldrich began his gentle examination, asking Liora quiet questions about her pregnancy and general health, Thorne moved to the window and stared out at his kingdom with new eyes. Somewhere in his court, someone had betrayed not only him, but the woman he loved. Someone had orchestrated this elaborate deception, letting him believe Liora was dead while condemning her to years of slavery. The child she carried, was it his? The timing seemed right, though he couldn't be certain. The thought that he might have an heir, conceived in those perfect days before everything went wrong, filled him with a complex mixture of hope and terror. Behind him, he heard Aldrich's gentle voice reassuring Liora that both she and the baby seemed healthy despite her ordeal. The physician quietly asked about her treatment as a slave, his tone growing grimmer as she reluctantly provided details. When the examination was complete, Aldrich approached Thorne with concern etched in his weathered features. "The child appears healthy and will likely arrive within the month," he said quietly. "But the mother has endured significant trauma, both physical and emotional. She's undernourished and exhausted. She needs rest, proper food, and time to heal." Thorne nodded, his jaw tight with suppressed anger. "She'll have everything she needs." As Aldrich packed his instruments and departed with promises to return daily, Thorne turned back to Liora. She was watching him with wariness and something that might have been the ghost of old affection. "You don't have to be afraid of me," he said softly. "Whatever happened between then and now, whatever you've been told or made to believe, I loved you." "I still don't," she whispered, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "Please don't say words that used to mean everything to me. I can't bear it." The distance between them felt vast as an ocean, filled with years of pain and betrayal that he was only beginning to understand. But she was alive, and she was here, and he would spend the rest of his life making amends for failing to protect her, even if she never forgave him. The royal chambers had been transformed overnight. Soft cushions replaced hard chairs, warm. Blankets were draped within easy reach, and a small table held an array of foods chosen specifically for a pregnant woman's needs. Thorne had slept in his study, giving Liora the privacy and space she desperately needed. When he entered the next morning, he found her standing by the window in a clean dress that one of the maids had provided. The simple blue fabric was well made, but modest, nothing that would mark her as different from any other woman in the castle. Yet to Thorne, she looked more regal than any queen who had ever worn a crown. "Did you sleep?" he asked gently, noting the way she kept one hand on the window frame for support. "Some," she replied without turning around. Her voice was stronger today, though still guarded. "Your physician returned early this morning. He seems kind. Master Aldrich is the best healer in the kingdom. He'll take good care of you and the baby." At the mention of the child, Liora's free hand moved to her belly in that protective gesture he was beginning to recognize. The silence stretched between them, filled with questions neither seemed ready to voice. "I need to ask you something," Thorne said finally, settling into a chair where she could see him without feeling cornered. "The child you carry, is it mine?" Liora's shoulders tensed, and for a long moment she didn't respond. When she finally turned from the window, her green eyes held a mixture of pain and resignation. "Does it matter?" she asked. "You're the king. You have the power to claim any child as yours or deny any that prove inconvenient." "It matters to me," he said quietly. "Not for politics or succession or any of the reasons you might think. It matters because if that child is mine, then I've already failed as a father by not being here to protect you both." Something flickered in her expression. Surprise, perhaps, or the faintest echo of the trust they had once shared. "The timing would be right," she admitted after another long pause, But I was a slave for 3 years, Your Majesty. I wasn't always able to refuse. The implications of her words hit him like a physical blow. The idea that she might have been forced to endure such violations while carrying his child filled him with a rage so pure and terrible that for a moment he couldn't speak. "I'm sorry," he said, when he could trust his voice again. "I'm so sorry for what you've suffered, for what I failed to prevent." "You didn't know I was alive," she replied, but there was no forgiveness in her tone, only factual acknowledgement. A sharp knock at the door interrupted them. Marcus entered with clear reluctance, his expression grim with news that couldn't wait. "Your Majesty, Lord Cassius requests an urgent audience. He says it concerns the woman." Thorne's eyes narrowed. Cassius was his chief advisor, a man who had served his father before him and had been instrumental in helping Thorne claim the throne. He was also one of the few people who had known about Liora's existence, though Thorne had never revealed. The depth of his feelings for her send him in, Thorne decided, though every instinct warned him to be cautious. Lord Cassius entered with his usual confident stride, his silver hair immaculately groomed and his rich robes announcing his status. As chief among the king's counselors, he was a handsome man, despite his 60 years, with the kind of polished charm that served well in court politics. His pale blue eyes swept over Liora with an expression that might have been curiosity or calculation. "Your Majesty," Cassius said, with a deep bow, "I came as soon as I heard about your acquisition from yesterday's auction. The court is buzzing with speculation." "Let them speculate," Thorne replied evenly. "This woman is under my protection." "Of course, Your Majesty, though I confess I'm concerned about the potential implications." Cassius's gaze flicked again to Liora, who had gone very still beside the window. A pregnant slave in the king's chambers will inevitably raise questions about the child's parentage. The child's parentage is not the court's concern. "Perhaps not, but your enemies will try to make it their weapon." Cassius moved closer, his voice taking on the persuasive tone that had served him well in countless political negotiations. "If the child is yours, some will claim you've legitimized it by acknowledging the mother. If it's not yours, they'll whisper that you've gone soft, wasting royal resources on broken goods." Thorne stood slowly, his height and presence suddenly filling the room with barely contained menace. "You will not refer to her as goods again." "My apologies, Your Majesty. I meant no disrespect." Cassius bowed again, but Thorne caught something in the man's expression, a flash of something that might have been satisfaction before it was quickly hidden. "I'm simply concerned for your reputation and the stability of the kingdom." "My reputation can weather a few whispers," Thorne said, coldly, "and anyone who mistakes compassion for weakness is welcome to test that assumption personally." After Cassius departed with promises to manage the court's concerns, Thorne found himself alone with Liora again. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "He doesn't like me being here," she observed quietly. "Cassius doesn't like anything that complicates his careful political calculations," Thorne replied. "But his concerns don't matter. You're staying because you think the child is yours?" Thorne met her gaze directly. "Because you're Liora, and you matter to me regardless of anything else." For the first time since he had found her, he saw tears that weren't born of fear or pain, but of something more complex. Grief, perhaps, for the simpler love they had once shared, or maybe just exhaustion at the thought of hope in a world that had given her little reason to trust it. The afternoon brought other visitors, servants seeking instructions, knights reporting on border patrols, clerks with documents requiring the king's seal. Through it all, Liora remained quietly in his chambers, sometimes sleeping in the comfortable chair by the fire, sometimes standing at the window watching the castle's daily rhythms. As evening approached, Thorne found himself studying an ancient scroll that Marcus had retrieved from the royal archives, a genealogical document that traced the bloodlines of the kingdom's ruling families. If the child Liora carried was indeed his, It would have a legitimate claim to the throne, which would make both mother and baby targets for anyone who opposed his rule. "What are you reading?" Liora asked, approaching the desk where he worked. "Bloodline records," he replied honestly. "If our child is born here, acknowledged by me, it will be legally recognized as my heir." "Our child," she repeated softly, and he realized it was the first time either of them had spoken the words aloud. "I believe it is," he said, looking up at her. "But even if it weren't, even if you had been with someone else, I would still protect you both." She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to find traces of the man she had once known beneath the crown and the years of ruling. "You've changed," she said finally. "So have you," he replied. "We've both survived things we never should have had to face." "Yes," she agreed, her hand moving to her belly again. "But some things survive too, even when we think they're gone forever." For the first time since he had found her, Thorne allowed himself to hope that they might find their way back to each other. It would take time, patience, and probably more pain before they could heal the wounds that 3 years of separation and suffering had carved into both their hearts. But she was alive. She was here, and despite everything that had happened, when she looked at him in that moment, he caught a glimpse of the woman who had once promised to wait for him under the stars. 3 days passed in careful routines that felt both familiar and strange. Liora ate the meals Thorne had specially prepared for her, allowed Master Aldrich to monitor her pregnancy, and slowly began to regain some of the strength that slavery had stolen from her. But the wariness never left her eyes, and she flinched whenever anyone moved too quickly in her presence. Thorne found himself restructuring his entire day around her needs. Morning audiences with petitioners were shortened so he could share breakfast with her. Evening councils were postponed when she seemed tired or unwell. His advisors grew increasingly frustrated with these changes, but he found he cared less about their opinions with each passing hour. "You're coddling her," Lord Cassius said during a private meeting in Thorne's study. "The court is beginning to talk, Your Majesty. Some are wondering if you've lost sight of your duties to the kingdom." "My duties include protecting those who cannot protect themselves," Thorne replied without looking up from the reports he was reviewing, "especially those who carry the future of our bloodline." "If the child is yours," Cassius pointed out with his characteristic bluntness, "we have no proof of that beyond her word and timing that could be coincidental." Thorne's quill paused in its movement across the parchment. "Are you suggesting she's lying?" "I'm suggesting caution, Your Majesty. You've developed strong feelings for this woman very quickly. Perhaps those feelings are influencing your judgment." The criticism stung because it contained a grain of truth. Thorne's feelings for Liora weren't new or sudden. They were 3 years old and had never truly died. But Cassius didn't know that, which meant the advisor was operating from incomplete information when he offered his counsel. "My judgment remains sound," Thorne said firmly, "and my decisions regarding her are final." After Cassius left with obvious dissatisfaction, Thorne returned to his chambers to find Liora attempting to mend one of her few dresses. Her fingers worked carefully with needle and thread, but he could see the frustration in her movements when the worn fabric proved difficult to repair. "The seamstresses could make you new clothes," he offered, settling into the chair across from her. "I don't need charity," she replied, not looking up from her work. "It wouldn't be charity. It would be necessity. You're living in the royal chambers now, and you'll need appropriate clothing." "Am I living here?" she asked, finally meeting his gaze. "Or am I just a more comfortable prisoner?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Thorne realized he hadn't made her situation clear, had been so focused on caring for her that he hadn't considered how his protection might feel like another form of captivity. "You're free to leave whenever you choose," he said carefully. "Though, I hope you'll stay, at least until the baby is born. You need medical care that I can provide here." "And after the baby is born? What then?" Thorne hesitated, aware that his next words would reveal more than he was ready to share. "That would depend on what you wanted, what would make you happy." "I don't remember what happiness feels like," she admitted, her voice so quiet he had to strain to hear it. For 3 years, I focused only on surviving each day. I'm not sure I know how to want things anymore. The honesty in her confession broke something open in his chest. He had spent those same 3 years believing she was dead, but at least he had been free to grieve and eventually find purpose in his work. She had been trapped in circumstances he could barely imagine, forced to endure degradation and abuse while carrying what might be his child. "Then we'll figure it out together," he said, "one day at a time." That evening, as they shared a quiet dinner by the fireplace, Liora began to tell him about her years in captivity. The words came slowly, painfully, but she seemed to need to speak them, as if voicing the horror might somehow diminish its power over her. She had been sold first to a merchant who used Omega slaves for breeding stock. When that man died in a plague, she was sold again to a noble family who worked their slaves from dawn to dusk. The pregnancy had saved her from the worst abuses, but had also made her more valuable as property, something to be protected only, until the child could be born and sold separately. "I used to dream about you," she said, staring into the fire. "In the beginning I imagined you would come for me, that somehow you would find out I was alive and rescue me." "I would have," Thorne said fiercely. "If I had known, nothing would have stopped me from finding you." "I know," she replied. And for the first time, her smile held a trace of genuine warmth. "That's what kept me alive some days, knowing that if you could, you would move heaven and earth to get to me." As the fire burned low and evening deepened into night, they sat in comfortable silence that reminded them both of other evenings in a small cottage far from the complications of crown and court. It wasn't the same. Too much pain lay between now and then. But it was a beginning. When Liora rose to retire to the bed he had given her, she paused beside his chair. "Thank you," she said simply, "for buying me, for bringing me here, for believing." "Me? Thank you for surviving," he replied, "for staying strong enough to come back to me." She didn't respond to that, but as she walked toward the bed, Thorne thought he saw something in her posture that hadn't been there before. Not hope, exactly, but perhaps the possibility that hope might one day return. Outside his window, the kingdom settled into peaceful sleep, unaware that their king was slowly reclaiming the only treasure that had ever truly mattered to him. The morning after the second assassination attempt brought troubling news from across the kingdom. Reports flooded in from border towns and trading posts. Enemy armies were massing beyond Valenhall's borders, their movements coordinated with military precision that suggested careful planning rather than opportunistic aggression. Thorne stood in his war room, studying the maps that Marcus had spread across the massive oak table. Red markers indicated enemy positions. Blue showed his own forces, and the picture they painted was increasingly grim. 5,000 soldiers, maybe more, Marcus reported, his weathered face grave with concern. "They're not raiders or bandits, Your Majesty. These are organized armies flying the banners of rival kingdoms." "Which kingdoms?" "Eastern duchies mainly, with support from some southern lords who've always questioned your legitimacy. They're calling it a liberation force, claiming they're freeing Valenhall from a king who's lost his way." Thorne's jaw tightened as he absorbed the implications. His enemies weren't just challenging his military strength, they were challenging his fitness to rule, using his protection of Liora as evidence that he had become weak and distracted. "They think I've gone soft," he said, understanding the strategy behind the timing. A pregnant slave in the king's chambers, resources diverted to her care, assassination attempts that suggest internal weakness. They believe this is their moment to strike. That's how they're presenting it to their troops and their allies, Marcus confirmed. "They're saying the Alpha King has been compromised by his attachment to an Omega who's probably carrying another man's bastard." The words hit like physical blows, not because Thorne doubted his relationship with Liora, but because he could see how effectively his enemies were weaponizing that relationship against him. Every kindness he showed her, every resource he devoted, to her protection was being twisted into evidence of poor judgment and compromised leadership. What do our intelligence networks report about their true motivations? Thorne asked. Land, primarily. Your agricultural reforms have made Valenhall prosperous, while neighboring kingdoms struggle with failed harvests and trade disputes. They want our resources, and they're using the situation with Lady Liora as justification for taking them. Thorne walked to the window that overlooked his thriving capital city. Below, merchants conducted business in busy markets. Children played in clean streets, and citizens went about their daily lives with the confidence that came from living under just rule. Everything he had worked to build was now threatened because he had chosen love over political expediency. Your Majesty, came a soft voice from the doorway. Thorne turned to see Liora entering the war room, moving carefully but with determination. She had insisted on getting out of bed despite Master Aldrich's protests, claiming that lying around feeling helpless was worse for her health than moderate activity. You shouldn't be up, Thorne said, immediately moving to support her. I needed to see the maps, she replied, studying the tactical situation with eyes that held more intelligence than most of his advisors possessed. I heard the reports. This is because of me, isn't it? Marcus shifted uncomfortably, but Thorne met her gaze directly. This is because of ambitious men who see opportunity in manufactured weakness. You're just the excuse they're using. That's not the same thing, she said quietly, one hand resting on her rounded belly. If I weren't here, they couldn't use our relationship against you. If you weren't here, I wouldn't be the man they claim I am, Thorne replied firmly. You don't make me weak, Liora. You make me fight harder for things that matter. But your enemies don't see it that way. My enemies are about to learn exactly how wrong they can be. A messenger arrived with fresh intelligence that painted an even grimmer picture. The enemy forces were better equipped and more numerous than initial reports had suggested, and they were receiving support from kingdoms that had previously remained neutral in regional conflicts. They're not just challenging you, Marcus said after reviewing the new information. They're challenging the entire political order you've established. Your agricultural reforms, your trade policies, your protection of Omega rights. Other rulers see these changes as threats to their own authority. Thorne felt a grim satisfaction at this revelation. If his enemies were willing to go to war over his domestic policies, it meant those policies were working exactly as intended. The old order of exploitation and oppression was fighting back because it recognized a genuine threat to its continued existence. Then we'll show them what the new order can accomplish, he decided. Send word to our allies, every kingdom that has benefited from our trade agreements, every lord who has seen prosperity grow under our policies. Remind them that what we've built together is worth defending. And if they're not enough? Liora asked quietly. Thorne looked at her, this woman who had survived slavery and torture and assassination attempts, who was now carrying his children while enemy armies gathered at their borders, and felt his love for her transform into something harder and more dangerous than any sword. Then we'll fight with what we have and trust that right makes might rather than the other way around. As the day progressed, responses began arriving from across the continent. Some allies pledged immediate military support, while others offered supplies and safe passage for refugees if the worst should happen. But several kingdoms that Thorne had counted as friends sent regrets and diplomatic excuses, clearly unwilling to risk themselves for a king they now viewed as politically compromised. We're outnumbered 2-1, Marcus reported that evening, as they finalized their defensive preparations, maybe 3-1 if their remaining allies commit troops. Have you ever known me to be deterred by poor odds? Thorne asked. No, Your Majesty, but you've never had so much to lose before. It was true. Previously, Thorne had faced battles with only his own life at stake. Now he was fighting for Liora, for their unborn children, for the future of everything they might build together. The weight of those additional stakes was enormous, but it was also empowering. "Sometimes," he said, looking toward the chambers where Liora was resting under heavy guard, "having more to lose makes you fight harder, not weaker." That night, as enemy campfires twinkled like malevolent stars across the valley, Thorne made his final preparations for a war that would determine not just his political survival, but whether love could triumph over the forces that sought to destroy it for the sake of maintaining an unjust status quo. The second assassination attempt was more sophisticated than the first. It came disguised as kindness, a servant girl bringing Liora a tray of tea and honey cakes, her smile bright and innocent as she set the refreshments beside the chair where Liora was resting. The girl curtsied prettily and departed with soft-spoken wishes for the lady's health and comfort. Thorne arrived an hour later to find Liora collapsed on the floor, convulsing and gasping for air. The teacup lay shattered beside her, its contents staining the stone floor with spreading dark liquid. "Guards!" he roared, dropping to his knees beside her. "Get Master Aldrich! Now!" Leora's eyes were wide with terror and pain, her hand clutching at her throat as if she couldn't breathe. Foam specked her lips, and her body jerked with violent spasms that made Thorne's heart race with helpless panic. Master Aldrich arrived within minutes, his face grim as he took in the scene. "Poison," he said tersely, already reaching for his medical bag. "Help me get her to the bed." The next hour was the longest of Thorne's life. He watched helplessly as Aldrich worked to save both Liora and their unborn child, administering counteragents and herbs while monitoring her breathing and heartbeat. Her convulsions gradually subsided, but she remained unconscious and dangerously pale. "Will she live?" Thorne asked when Aldrich finally stepped back from the bed. The poison was nightbane extract, deadly but slow-acting. If she had consumed the full dose, both she and the child would be dead by now. Fortunately, she seems to have taken only a few sips before recognizing the bitter taste. And the baby, too early to tell. The next few days will be critical. Thorne stationed himself beside Leora's bed and refused to leave for the rest of the day. He held her hand, spoke to her unconscious form, and silently raged against whoever was systematically trying to destroy the only happiness he had ever known. When she finally woke near midnight, her first word was his name. "I'm here," he said, immediately, leaning over her so she could see his face. "You're safe. Aldrich says you'll both be fine." "Someone tried to kill me," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the poison's effects. "Someone tried to kill us," he corrected grimly. "This was about eliminating my heir as much as eliminating you." Leora's hand moved to her belly, and relief flooded her features when she felt the baby's movement. "Who would do this?" "I don't know yet, but I intend to find out." Thorne's voice carried the cold promise of retribution that had made him feared. "On battlefields across the continent. And when I do, they'll learn that there are worse fates than death." The investigation into the poisoning revealed disturbing truths about the depth of the conspiracy against them. The servant girl who had delivered the tea was found dead in her quarters, apparently having taken her own life rather than face questioning. But Marcus's careful examination of her belongings revealed a silver coin bearing the mark of a professional assassin's guild. "This level of organization requires significant resources," Marcus reported during a private meeting with Thorne. "We're not dealing with simple court jealousy or random malcontents. Someone is funding a systematic campaign against the woman and her child." "Any leads on who?" "The silver coin came from the Eastern Kingdoms, the same ones massing troops on our borders, but it could have been planted to misdirect our investigation." Thorne studied the reports spread across his desk, looking for patterns that might reveal the true enemy. The attacks on Liora had been carefully planned and executed with inside knowledge of the castle's routines. The person behind them had access to detailed information about her daily movements and the castle's security procedures. "Someone in the court is feeding information to our enemies," he concluded. "Someone close enough to know which servants attend to her, which routes She takes through the castle. That's a serious accusation, Your Majesty. It's the only explanation that fits the facts. Thorne's jaw tightened as he considered the implications. We have a traitor in our inner circle. The realization that someone he trusted might be working against him was almost as painful as discovering Liora's continued existence. His advisors, his knights, his servants, he had worked for 3 years to build a government based on loyalty and mutual respect. To think that someone had been betraying that trust while smiling in his face was a poison more bitter than anything that had been placed in Liora's tea. That night, as he sat vigil beside Liora's bed while she slept off the lingering effects of the poison, Thorne made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences for both his kingdom and his heart. He would not send her away for her safety, as political wisdom might dictate. He would not hide their relationship to appease his enemies or calm his nervous advisors. Instead, he would stand and fight for her, for their child, and for the right to love without asking permission from those who would use that love against him. The choice would likely cost him dearly, but some things were worth any price. As he watched her sleep, one hand resting protectively over their unborn child, Thorne knew with absolute certainty that she was one of them. The truth came from an unexpected source, a dying confession that shattered everything Thorne thought. He knew about the past 3 years. Sir Garrett, one of his father's old knights, and a man Thorne had trusted since childhood, lay on his deathbed after suffering a sudden collapse during morning drills. Master Aldrich's examination revealed signs of slow poisoning, the same nightbane extract that had nearly killed Liora, but administered in smaller doses over many months. Someone has been killing him slowly, Aldrich reported grimly. He has, perhaps, hours left. When Thorne arrived at Garrett's bedside, the old knight gripped his arm with surprising strength for a dying man. "My king," Garrett gasped, his weathered face twisted with pain and urgency. "I must tell you, before I face judgment." "Rest easy, old friend. You've served faithfully." "No," Garrett said, struggling to sit up. "I betrayed you 3 years ago. Lord Cassius came to me with orders he claimed were yours, said the Omega Healer was a threat to your rule, that she would make you weak when you needed to be strong." Thorne's blood turned to ice. "What orders?" "To eliminate her, make it look like raiders. Cassius said you couldn't bring yourself to give the order directly, that you needed someone else to handle the unpleasant necessity." The words hit Thorne like physical blows. "You killed her. Grandmother, you burned the cottage." "We thought we killed her too," Garrett whispered, tears streaming down his cheeks. "The plan was to drug her with sleeping herbs, then burn the cottage so it would look like she died in the fire. But she wasn't there when we came. We found only the old woman. So you sold her instead," Thorne said, his voice deadly quiet. "Cassius said it would be kinder than death, that she could build a new life elsewhere. We told you she had died in the fire because we thought it would be easier for you to mourn and move on." Thorne stood slowly, his mind reeling with the implications of this confession. Cassius, his most trusted advisor, the man who had helped him navigate the treacherous early days of his reign, had orchestrated the entire betrayal, had convinced loyal knights that they were following Thorne's secret orders while simultaneously destroying the only woman Thorne had ever loved. "Why?" Thorne asked, though he suspected. He already knew the answer. He said you were too attached to her, that a king needed to marry for political advantage, not personal desire, that the Omega Healer would make you weak and vulnerable to your enemies. And you believed him? Garrett's laugh was bitter and dying. "He showed me a letter, your seal, your handwriting, instructions to eliminate any personal attachments that might compromise your ability to rule effectively." The old knight's grip tightened on Thorne's arm. It wasn't your letter, was it?" "No," Thorne said softly. "It wasn't my letter." Garrett closed his eyes, tears still flowing. "Then I've spent 3 years watching you grieve for something I helped destroy. God forgive me. After Garrett died an hour later, Thorne found himself staring at the silver coin Marcus had recovered from the assassin's belongings. The mark he had assumed belonged to an Eastern Assassins Guild was actually something more familiar, a symbol used by the intelligence network that Cassius had built to protect the kingdom from internal threats. The man who had helped him build. His government had been systematically destroying it from within, using Thorne's own resources and authority to eliminate anything he viewed as a threat to his carefully maintained political order. "How long has he been planning this?" Thorne asked Marcus as they reviewed 3 years of decisions, looking for signs of Cassius's manipulation. "Probably since before you took the crown," Marcus replied grimly. "Look at this. Every political marriage he's suggested, every alliance he's recommended, every enemy he's helped you defeat. They all serve to consolidate power in ways that benefit him." The pattern was clear once they knew what to look for. Cassius had positioned himself as indispensable while slowly eliminating anyone who might offer Thorne alternative counsel or personal loyalty that superseded political calculation. The destruction of Thorne's relationship with Liora hadn't been an isolated incident. It had been part of a larger strategy to ensure that the king remained dependent on his chief advisors' guidance. He's been building towards something, Thorne realized. This wasn't just about controlling my personal life. He wants the throne itself. That evening, when Thorne returned to his chambers, he found Liora sitting by the fire with a piece of parchment in her hands. Her face was pale, and he could see she had been crying. "What is it?" he asked, settling beside her. "Master Aldrich examined me more thoroughly today," she said quietly. The babies are due sooner than we thought." "Babies?" Thorne's heart nearly stopped. "Twins." "Yes, and they're positioned in a way that suggests they're both strong and healthy." She looked up at him with eyes that held wonder and terror in equal measure. "Aldrich says they show signs of being alpha-born, both of them." The implications hit Thorne like lightning. Twin alpha heirs would secure his bloodline beyond any question, would eliminate any doubt about succession, and would make his enemies' current military build-up seem like child's play compared to what they would attempt once word of the twins spread. "Does anyone else know?" he asked. "Only Aldrich, and he swore an oath of silence, but he said I might give birth within days rather than weeks. The stress of the poison, the assassination attempts." She placed both hands over her belly. "Our children are eager to enter this world." Thorne knelt beside her chair, covering her hands with his own. "Then we need to end this conspiracy before they're born. I won't have my children enter a world where they're targets from their first breath. What are you going to do?" "What I should have done 3 years ago," he said, his voice carrying the steel that had won him a crown and a kingdom. "I'm going to trust the right people and eliminate the wrong ones." As if summoned by his words, a soft knock came at the door. Lord Cassius entered with his usual confident bearing, but Thorne now noticed things he had missed before. The way the man's eyes immediately assessed Leora's condition, the subtle satisfaction in his expression when he saw her obvious distress. "Your Majesty," Cassius said with his customary bow, "I came to check on the woman's health after hearing about today's unfortunate incident." "How thoughtful of you," Thorne replied, his tone giving nothing away. "Though I'm curious, how did you hear? About an incident that was kept strictly confidential?" For just a moment something flickered in Cassius's pale blue eyes. "Castle walls have ears, Your Majesty. Servants talk." "Yes," Thorne agreed quietly. "They do. And sometimes they reveal more than they intend." The confrontation was coming, inevitable, as sunrise. But not yet. Not until Thorne was ready to face the full scope of his advisor's betrayal and the true cost of reclaiming the love he had thought lost forever. War came to Valenhall like a storm that had been building on the horizon. For weeks, the enemy armies reached the kingdom's borders at dawn, their banners visible from the castle's highest towers. 5,000 soldiers in coordinated formation, armed and provisioned for a siege that could last months. Thorne stood in his war room, surrounded by maps and reports, planning the defense of everything he had built. His generals argued over troop deployments and supply lines, while scouts brought regular updates on enemy movements. The invading armies had positioned themselves with tactical precision, cutting off major trade routes and blocking potential escape paths. "They're not here for conquest," Sir Marcus observed, studying the enemy positions. "This formation is designed, though for siege warfare, they mean to starve us out or force me into a decisive battle on their terms," Thorne replied grimly. "They think I'll make mistakes to end this quickly, because of the woman." Thorne's jaw tightened. Everyone knew about Liora now, her presence in his chambers, her advanced pregnancy, the resources he was devoting to her protection. His enemies had calculated correctly that he wouldn't risk a prolonged siege with her so close to giving birth. "Your Majesty," one of his captains interrupted, "Lord Cassius requests immediate audience. He says it concerns urgent intelligence about the enemy. Commanders." Thorne nodded for the man to be admitted, though suspicion now colored every interaction with his chief advisor. Since Garrett's deathbed confession, Thorne had been carefully watching Cassius, noting things that had previously seemed like political wisdom, but now appeared more sinister. Cassius entered with scrolls under his arm and determination in his bearing. "Your Majesty, I've been analyzing the enemy leadership, and I believe I've identified a weakness we can exploit." He spread a detailed map across the war table, pointing to positions marked with enemy commanders' names and estimated troop strengths. The intelligence was remarkably detailed, too detailed for information gathered by conventional scouting. "How did you come by this information?" Thorne asked carefully. "Sources I've cultivated over the years for the kingdom's protection," Cassius replied smoothly. "The Eastern commander, Lord Draven, is known for his impatience. If we can make him think we're weaker than we are, he might break formation and attack prematurely." It was sound tactical advice, but Thorne found himself questioning everything. Cassius suggested now, was this genuine counsel or another manipulation designed to serve the advisor's hidden agenda? Before he could respond, a commotion in the hallway drew their attention. Shouts and running footsteps echoed off the stone. "Walls!" followed by a servant's panicked voice calling for Master Aldrich. Thorne's blood turned to ice. "Liora!" He ran through the castle corridors with Marcus close behind, taking stairs 3 at a time and shouldering past startled servants. When he burst into his chambers, he found Liora doubled over beside the bed, her face contorted with pain, and her dress soaked with fluid. "The babies are coming," she gasped, one hand gripping the bedpost for support. I think it's time." Master Aldrich arrived moments later with his assistants and immediately took charge of the situation. "Your Majesty, I need you to leave so we can prepare properly." "I'm not leaving her." "You're not helping her by staying," Aldrich said firmly. "Birth is women's work, and your presence will only make her more anxious. Trust me to care for her." "As I have been doing." Thorne reluctantly allowed Marcus to escort him from the chamber, but he couldn't go far. He paced the hallway outside his door like a caged wolf, listening to the sounds of preparation and Leora's occasional cries of pain. "The timing is unfortunate," Cassius observed, appearing beside him with that calculating expression that Thorne was beginning to hate. "The enemy will see this as the perfect moment to press their attack. Then we'll have to prove them wrong. Perhaps it would be wiser to negotiate. Offer them tribute to withdraw. Buy time until the woman has recovered and the situation is more stable." Thorne turned to study his advisor's face. "You think I should pay enemies to leave my kingdom alone because my woman is giving birth? I think you should consider all options before committing to a battle you might not win." The suggestion was reasonable on its surface, but Thorne heard something else beneath Cassius's words. Eagerness, perhaps, for Thorne to appear weak before his own people. A king who paid tribute to avoid fighting would lose respect that might never be recovered. "No," Thorne said firmly, "we fight tomorrow if necessary, and if the woman dies in childbirth, If you lose both her and the children while fighting a war you could have avoided, the cruel possibility hit exactly where Cassius had aimed it. Thorne might indeed lose everything he was fighting to protect. Liora, his children, his throne, his kingdom. The gamble was enormous, the stakes higher than any he had ever faced. But as Liora's cry of pain echoed through the door, followed by Aldrich's encouraging voice, Thorne realized that some risks were worth taking regardless of the odds. Love required courage, and courage sometimes demanded impossible choices. Then I'll face that loss, as a king should, Thorne replied, fighting for what matters most. A new sound came from his chambers, not pain this time, but the thin, powerful cry of a newborn child. Thorne's heart stopped, then began beating so hard he could hear it in his ears. Marcus gripped his shoulder. "Congratulations, Your Majesty," but the celebration was premature. Aldrich's voice came urgent and strained. "Your Majesty, I need you now!" Thorne burst through the door to find organized chaos. Liora lay pale and exhausted on the bed, holding a tiny, red-faced infant, while Aldrich worked frantically over her. Blood stained the sheets, and her breathing was shallow and labored. "The second child is in distress," Aldrich said without looking up. "The birth cord is wrapped around its neck. I need to act quickly." The next 20 minutes tested Thorne's courage more severely than any battle he had ever fought. He held Liora's hand while she struggled through the complicated delivery of their second child, feeling helpless as she poured the last of her strength into bringing their son safely into the world. When the second cry finally filled the room, strong and healthy, Thorne felt tears he hadn't shed since childhood streaming down his face. "2 sons," Aldrich announced with exhausted satisfaction. "Both healthy, both clearly alpha-born. Your heirs, Your Majesty." But as Thorne looked down at Liora, he saw that she had slipped into unconsciousness, her face dangerously pale from blood loss. "Will she live?" he asked, the words barely audible. "I don't know," Aldrich replied honestly. "The next few hours will tell us everything." Outside the castle walls, enemy war horns began to sound, their deep notes carrying promises of violence and conquest. Inside, Thorne knelt beside the bed where the woman he loved fought for her life, while their newborn son slept peacefully in her arms, unaware that the world they had entered was balanced on the edge of a blade. The enemy attack began at first light, just as Liora opened her eyes for the first time since giving birth. Thorne had maintained his vigil through the night, alternately, watching her pale face for signs of improvement and listening to the distant sounds of army preparation. "The babies," she whispered, her voice weak but urgent. "They're safe," Thorne assured her, helping her sit up carefully. 2 sons, both healthy and strong. Master Aldrich had placed the infants in a specially prepared cradle near the fireplace, where they slept peacefully, despite the chaos beginning outside their windows. Liora's eyes filled with tears as she looked at them, not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming love and relief. "They're beautiful," she breathed. "They're perfect." Thorne agreed, just like their mother. The moment of peace was shattered by the sound of war horns echoing across the valley. Through the window they could see the enemy armies beginning their advance, organized formations of cavalry and infantry moving with deadly precision toward the castle walls. "You have to go," Liora said, reading his expression. "Your kingdom needs you. My family needs me too. Your family will be meaningless if there's no kingdom left to inherit." She struggled to push herself further upright, wincing, with pain but determined to meet his eyes. "I've seen what happens when good kings fall to bad men. Go fight for everything we both believe in." A thunderous crash echoed through the castle as the first enemy catapults found their range. Dust rained from the ceiling, and one of the babies stirred with a soft cry that Liora immediately soothed with gentle humming. Marcus burst through the door without ceremony, his armor already blood-stained from early skirmishes. "Your Majesty, they've breached the outer walls. We need you in the courtyard, now." Thorne looked at his sword hanging on the wall, then at Liora, holding their newborn sons, and felt the terrible weight of impossible choices. Every instinct, as a warrior told him to fight, Every instinct as a man told him to stay and protect his family. "Go," Liora said again, reaching for his hand. "I trust you to come back to us." He knelt beside the bed and kissed her forehead, then each of their sons in turn. "I love you, all of you, and I will come back. I know," she replied with a smile that was weak but genuine. "You're the king who keeps his promises." The castle courtyard was organized chaos when Thorne emerged in full battle armor, his father's sword at his side and the crown of the Alpha Kings secured firmly on his head. His troops rallied at the sight of him, their battle cries echoing off the stone walls as they prepared for the fight of their lives. "Status report," he commanded as Marcus fell into step beside him. "They've taken the outer bailey, but the inner walls are holding. Lord Draven is leading the eastern forces personally. He's calling for single combat to settle this without further bloodshed." Thorne's smile was cold and sharp. "How convenient. Does he specify terms?" "Winner takes all. If you fall, the kingdom submits to Eastern rule. If he falls, their armies withdraw and pay tribute for the next 10 years. It was a trap, obviously. Draven was 20 years younger than Thorne and had a reputation as one of the finest swordsmen in the Eastern kingdoms. But it was also an opportunity to end the siege quickly, before the fighting could spread to the areas of the castle where Liora and their children were vulnerable. "I accept," Thorne decided. "Your Majesty," Marcus protested. "This could be exactly what they want. If something happens to you, if something happens to me, you'll protect my family and find a way to preserve the kingdom. But I'm not going to hide behind castle walls while my enemies dictate terms." The single combat was to take place in the main courtyard, with both armies watching from the walls and battlements. As Thorne walked toward the center of the space, he felt the weight of every choice that had brought him to this moment, the decision to claim his throne, the failure to protect Liora initially, the determination to find her and fight for their future. Lord Draven was already waiting, his ornate armor gleaming in the morning sun and his famous blade held with casual confidence. He was indeed younger than Thorne, broader in the shoulders and fresher in the face, with the kind of arrogant bearing that came from too many easy victories. "King Thorne," Draven called out as they faced each other across the courtyard, "I had expected you to send a champion rather than risk yourself for the sake of a pregnant slave." "Then you understand me less than you think," Thorne replied, drawing his father's blade. The steel sang as it cleared the scabbard, and he felt the familiar balance of the weapon that had helped him win a kingdom. "Before we begin," Draven continued, "I want you to know that when you fall, your woman and her bastard children will be sold back into slavery. My Eastern lords have particular tastes for royal breeding stock." The taunt was designed to enrage him, to make him fight with emotion rather than strategy. Instead, it clarified everything for Thorne. This wasn't just about territory or politics, it was about humiliation, about reducing everything he valued to possessions that could be bought and sold. "When I win," Thorne said quietly, "you'll learn why they call me the Alpha King, the first." Clash of steel rang across the courtyard, like a bell tolling the beginning of the end. Lord Draven fought with the skill of a man who had never known defeat, his blade moving in precise arcs that spoke of years of training and natural talent. But Thorne fought with something more dangerous than skill. He fought with the desperate fury of a man protecting everything that made life worth living. Their swords met in a symphony of ringing steel that echoed off the courtyard walls. Draven's technique was flawless, his footwork elegant, his attacks calculated to exploit every perceived weakness in his opponent's defense. But Thorne had learned his swordwork in actual battles rather than practice yards, and he knew how to turn desperate situations into unexpected advantages. The duel raged across the courtyard stones, both men giving and receiving wounds that painted their armor with spreading crimson. Draven's youth and reach gave him early advantages, but Thorne's experience and raw determination kept him in the fight when lesser men would have fallen. High above them, unseen by the combatants below, Lord Cassius watched from a tower window with barely concealed satisfaction. The plan was working perfectly. Either Draven would kill Thorne, clearing the way for Cassius to claim regency until the infant princes came of age, or Thorne would win but be so weakened that a carefully timed accident could eliminate him. Later, what Cassius hadn't counted on was the sound that suddenly pierced the air above the clash of combat. A newborn's cry, strong and insistent, carrying from the royal chambers to the courtyard below. Thorne heard it and felt power surge through his tired muscles. His son was calling, demanding life and protection and a future worth inheriting. The knowledge that his children were awake and healthy in the castle above him transformed exhaustion into renewed strength. Draven heard it too, and made his fatal mistake. He paused for just a moment, his attention diverted by the sound and what it represented for his plans. In that instant of distraction, Thorne struck with the precision of a man who had nothing left to lose. His father's blade found the gap between Draven's helmet and gorget, sliding deep into the flesh beneath. The Eastern Lord's eyes widened with shock and the terrible understanding that his ambitions had died with his miscalculation. "Yield!" Thorne said, his sword point pressing against Draven's throat as the man fell to his knees. "I yield!" Draven gasped, blood frothing at his lips. "The armies withdraw." As the enemy forces began their retreat in accordance with the terms of single combat, Thorne looked up at the castle windows, where he knew Liora was listening to their son's cries. But his moment of triumph was interrupted by slow, deliberate applause. Lord Cassius descended into the courtyard, his expression no longer hiding the cold ambition that had driven him for years. "Magnificently done, Your Majesty, though I confess the outcome is less convenient than I had hoped." "What are you talking about?" Thorne demanded, though the pieces were already falling into place in his mind. "I'm talking about 3 years of careful planning that you've just complicated considerably," Cassius replied, his polished mask finally slipping completely. "Lord Draven was supposed to win this duel. Your death would have been tragic but heroic, and I would have served as regent until your infant sons came of age, assuming, of course, that they survived the dangerous early years of childhood." The courtyard had fallen silent, except for the distant sounds of retreating armies. Thorne's knights and soldiers stood frozen, uncertain how to process the revelation that their king's most trusted advisor had just confessed to treason. "You orchestrated all of this," Thorne said, understanding flooding through him. "The attacks on Liora, the enemy invasion, even this duel, it was all your design." "Of course it was. Did you really think those Eastern fools could coordinate such a sophisticated assault without inside guidance?" Cassius drew his own sword with fluid grace. "I've been building this moment since the day you took the crown. A king ruled by emotion, rather than logic, was always going to be a liability. You killed Garrett for discovering your plans. Poor Garrett started asking inconvenient questions about old orders and forged documents. The Nightbane poisoning was a mercy, much gentler than what awaited him if he had lived to expose my network." Thorne felt rage building in his chest, pure and cleansing as fire. And Liora? Was destroying her life also a mercy? "The Omega Healer was a weakness I couldn't allow you to indulge. A king needs to marry for political advantage, not personal satisfaction." "Your plans end here," Thorne said, raising his blade. The battle between king and traitor was swift and decisive. Cassius was skilled with a blade, but he had spent too many years in comfortable plotting. Thorne's sword found its mark within minutes, piercing Cassius's heart with the finality of justice long delayed. As his former advisor fell to the courtyard stones, Thorne looked up at his assembled forces and saw loyalty shining in faces that had chosen to stand with their king. "Anyone else?" he asked quietly. The silence that answered him was complete and absolute. 6 months later, on a golden autumn morning that reminded Thorne of the day he had first met Liora, the kingdom of Valenhall celebrated the coronation of their new queen. The ceremony was held in the castle's great hall, attended by nobles and common folk alike, all come to witness the formal union of their Alpha King with the Omega, who had captured his heart. Liora stood beside Thorne at the altar, radiant in a gown of deep blue silk that complemented her auburn hair and green eyes. The months of recovery had restored her health and strength, and motherhood had added a new dimension to her beauty, a confidence and purpose that made her seem born to wear a crown. In the front row, held by trusted nurses, their twin sons watched the proceedings with the solemn attention that seemed to characterize Alpha-born children even in infancy. Prince Marcus, named for the knight who had helped save them all, had his father's dark hair and serious expression. Prince Aldrich, named for the physician who had delivered them safely, showed signs of inheriting his mother's gentle nature despite his obvious alpha strength. Do you, Thorne, Alpha King of Valenhall, take this woman as your queen and mate, to honor and protect for all the days of your life? I do, Thorne replied, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. Before God and witnesses, I pledge my life, my crown, and my kingdom to her service. Do you, Liora, accept the crown and the burden of queenship to serve this kingdom and its people with wisdom and compassion? I do, she replied, and when the crown was placed on her head, it seemed to settle there as naturally as if it had been crafted specifically for her. The celebration that followed lasted 3 days and drew visitors from kingdoms across the continent. Lords and ladies who had once viewed Thorne's attachment to a former slave as weakness now saw the strength that came from a partnership built on genuine love and mutual respect. You've changed the entire political landscape, Marcus observed as they watched the festivities from the castle's great balcony. Half the nobles here are reconsidering their own marriage arrangements after seeing how happy you and the Queen are together. Good, Thorne replied. Perhaps future generations will understand that strength comes from building up rather than tearing down. On the final evening of celebration, Thorne and Liora escaped the formal festivities to walk alone. In the castle gardens, the same stars that had witnessed their first promises now looked down on their fulfilled commitment, and the autumn air carried the scent of herbs from the new healing garden that Liora had established for the castle's medical needs. Do you ever think about how different things might have been? She asked, as they paused beside the fountain at the garden's heart. Every day, he admitted. If Cassius hadn't interfered, if I had taken you with me from the beginning, if I had been smarter about protecting you, if any of those things had happened, we might not have learned what we were truly capable of surviving, she said thoughtfully. Our love was tested by separation, betrayal, slavery, war, and conspiracy. It survived all of that. Now we know it can survive anything. Thorne pulled her close, marveling at how perfectly she still fit in his arms, despite everything they had both endured. I thought I had lost you forever. Finding you again, it was like being given back my soul. You never lost me, she replied, looking up at him with eyes that held all the warmth and wisdom he remembered from their earliest days together. I was just waiting a little longer than either of us expected. From the castle windows above them came the sound of their sons' evening cries, demanding attention with the imperious nature of princes who had never known a world where their needs weren't immediately met. Thorne and Liora smiled at each other and turned back toward the castle, toward their children and their kingdom, and the future they had fought so hard to claim. The iron auction block where their story had begun its second chapter had been removed from the market square and replaced with a fountain dedicated to those who had suffered in slavery. On its base was inscribed a simple message: freedom is the birthright of every soul. As they walked hand in hand through the castle corridors, passing tapestries that now bore the combined crests of both their families, Thorne reflected on the strange journey that had brought them from a healer's cottage to a throne room. Love had indeed carved deep wounds, but it had also proven capable of healing them. The deepest wounds, he had learned, were indeed carved by the hands we once held in love. But those same hands, given a second chance, could also create something more beautiful than either person could have achieved alone. Their son's cries grew louder as they approached the nursery, and Liora quickened her pace with the urgency of a mother responding to her children's needs. Thorne followed, his crown secure on his head and his sword at his side, but his heart focused entirely on the small family that had made him understand the true meaning of wealth. In the nursery, as they lifted their sons and soothed their cries, with gentle words and loving touches, the kingdom settled into peaceful sleep around them. The enemies were defeated, the traitors eliminated, and the future stretched ahead bright with possibility. Some love stories, Thorne thought as he watched Liora sing softly to their children, are worth waiting for, even when the waiting lasts longer than anyone should have to endure. Even when the path back to each other leads through darkness and pain and the kind of betrayal that changes people forever. But in the end, love finds a way. And sometimes, if you're very fortunate and very stubborn and willing to fight for what matters most, you get the chance to discover that the deepest wounds can also become the foundations for the strongest healing. Outside the nursery windows, the kingdom of Valenhall slept peacefully under the protection of a king who had learned that true strength comes not from standing alone, but from fighting for those you love. And in the quiet of that peaceful night, two princes dreamed their first dreams while their parents watched over them, with the fierce devotion of people who understood exactly how precious second chances could be.